The story begins in a mysterious world floating thousands of kilometers above the sky, a place so dangerous that reaching it was almost a death sentence. Yet a group of soldiers risked everything to explore it. Moments after arriving, they encountered the most terrifying giant the world had ever seen. Jack sensed something approaching and immediately hid beneath the water. Seconds later, an enormous foot stepped into view, sending a flock of sheep running in panic. The giant casually grabbed one of the sheep and swallowed it whole. Watching this horrifying sight, Jack froze in fear. Nearby, another soldier hiding behind a tree glanced back to get a better look, but the giant caught his scent. The terrified soldier ducked behind the tree again, yet the creature began walking straight toward him. Unable to stay hidden any longer, the soldier broke into a run. It was already too late. The giant had spotted him. With incredible strength, it ripped an entire tree out of the ground and hurled it aside. The soldier ran for his life, but his tiny legs were no match for the giant's massive strides. Within seconds, the creature caught up and knocked him unconscious with a single blow. Curious, the giant bent down to examine the strange little human. Just as it was about to pick him up, the captain charged forward with his sword and drove it deep into the giant's heel. The giant roared in pain and turned around, but with one casual kick, it sent the captain flying through the air. It then pulled the sword from its foot, picked up both soldiers, and walked away, intending to eat them. The story Jack had just witnessed made him realize that coming here had been the biggest mistake of his life. A few days earlier, a priest had given Jack several magical beans. Later, when his girlfriend, who was also a princess, came to visit him, one of the beans accidentally came into contact with water. Within seconds, it began growing at an unbelievable speed. The entire wooden house started shaking violently as strange noises echoed from below. Before either of them could react, the ground split open and a gigantic beanstalk burst through the house, shooting high into the sky. Terrified, the princess tried to escape, but a heavy table collapsed on top of her. Jack rushed to help, but the vines suddenly threw him out of the house. At the same moment, a wooden door swung open, revealing an escape route for the princess. She ran toward it, but just as she reached the exit, the vines slammed the door shut. She desperately tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Outside, Jack grabbed an axe and started hacking at the vines. But before he could free her, the entire house was ripped from the ground and carried into the sky. At the very last second, Jack leaped and grabbed the edge of the structure. The beanstalk continued growing so rapidly that the house was lifted thousands of meters into the air. Jack kept chopping at the vine with all his strength until he finally cut through it. The princess managed to open the door, but the wooden floor beneath her suddenly collapsed. Even though Jack tried to hold onto her, she was carried away as the house continued soaring nearly 10,000 meters above the ground. Jack slid down the magical beanstalk toward Earth. Fortunately, the vines slowed his fall just enough for him to survive, though he was knocked unconscious on impact. The princess, however, wasn't as lucky. The giant beanstalk carried her all the way into the mysterious world above the clouds. The next morning, Jack woke up to find the king standing before him, desperately searching for his daughter. With no choice left, Jack told him everything. When he pointed toward the sky, everyone saw the enormous beanstalk stretching straight through the clouds. Realizing the princess was truly trapped above, the king immediately assembled a team of soldiers and sent them with Jack to rescue her. The group climbed the gigantic beanstalk and eventually emerged above the clouds. To reach the other side, the captain slid across a hanging vine, the only possible path forward. Jack reluctantly removed his belt and prepared to follow. But just as he hesitated, the curly-haired man standing behind him kicked him forward. Seeing the terrifying height, Jack panicked. Halfway across, his grip slipped and he plunged downward. Luckily, another vine caught him before he could fall to his death. As soon as he regained consciousness, Jack climbed back up without wasting a second. Near the top, the weather turned violent. Thunderstorms raged across the sky as lightning flashed all around them. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck one of the soldiers, causing him to lose his footing. The others collided with him and nearly fell as well. Fortunately, one soldier managed to grab the rope at the last moment, preventing the entire group from falling to their deaths. But the soldiers who had fallen were now hanging in midair. If they weren't pulled up immediately, the entire team would be in danger. Just then, Roderick turned to the man beside him and quietly said, "Cut the rope." The man immediately pulled the hidden knife from his boot. The soldiers hanging below desperately begged him not to do it, but without showing any mercy, he sliced through the rope. Within seconds, they fell nearly 10,000 feet to their deaths. The remaining soldiers somehow managed to reach the top, and by then morning had arrived. As Jack turned around, he was left speechless. Above the clouds lay an enormous hidden world unlike anything he had ever seen. Without wasting time, everyone moved forward. Soon, the captain noticed fresh footprints on the ground and realized the princess hadn't gone back down. She was still somewhere in this mysterious land. As the group stepped out of the cave, they were stunned by the breathtaking landscape. Everything here was far larger than they had imagined. While searching the area, they found marks the princess had left on tree branches. Around the same time, Jack also found the same book he had once given her. Moments later, they noticed several broken branches, making the captain realize that some gigantic creature had carried her away. With no time to waste, the group split into 2 teams and began searching in different directions. Meanwhile, Jack and his companions reached a river where they spotted a herd of giant sheep. Having gone hungry for days, they decided to catch one for food, but the moment they tried, they accidentally triggered a massive trap. Jack instantly pulled out his knife and began cutting through the net while the captain worked on the ropes. Just then, something strange happened. Every crow in the area suddenly flew away and the sheep ran in the opposite direction. The captain sensed something was terribly wrong, but continued cutting until they finally escaped the trap. A second later, a terrifying roar echoed through the jungle. Before they could react, a gigantic giant appeared, grabbed both soldiers and carried them away. Jack quietly followed behind the giant, hoping to rescue both his companions and the princess at the right moment. Elsewhere, Roderick and the remaining soldiers reached the edge of a cliff. The bald soldier suggested they should search another route instead of wasting time here, but Roderick suddenly pointed into the distance and shouted, "Look, there's Isabel!" The moment the bald soldier turned back toward the cliff, Roderick shoved him straight into the deep ravine. His companion burst into laughter, but it lasted only a moment. Suddenly, a gigantic hand grabbed him from behind. At the same time, another mountain-sized giant appeared before Roderick. Terrified, he collapsed to the ground and frantically searched through his bag. Just as the giant reached out to grab him, Roderick pulled out a glowing crown. The instant the giant saw it, they froze in place as if controlled by an invisible force. This wasn't an ordinary crown, it was a magical artifact that forced every giant to obey whoever wore it. Meanwhile, Jack secretly followed the giant all the way to its hidden kingdom. The place looked like paradise, surrounded by breathtaking waterfalls and towering mountains. There, he discovered a 2-headed giant holding the princess captive inside a huge cage. Moments later, the giant took her before the rest of its kind, who gathered around and stared at her. Soon another giant returned carrying the captain and the fat soldier. It threw both of them beside the cage. The 2-headed giant now suspected that more humans were hiding somewhere nearby. To intimidate the captain, it grabbed the fat soldier, snapped his neck, swallowed him alive, and then spat out his armor. The giant then turned toward the captain and threatened that the princess would be next. But before it could do anything, a loud voice echoed across the valley, drawing everyone's attention. It was none other than the traitor, Roderick. The moment the giants saw the magical crown on his head, every one of them immediately dropped to their knees. At that moment, Roderick's true plan was finally revealed. Roderick walked straight up to the 2-headed giant and ordered him to kneel. The moment the giant saw the magical crown, he had no choice but to obey. Roderick stepped onto the giant's face and slowly walked toward the throne. From that moment on, he crowned himself the new king of the giants. He immediately announced his plan to invade the human world and conquer the entire kingdom. The giant army roared in celebration, but the 2-headed giant clearly had something else on his mind. Meanwhile, the giant picked up the captain and threw him onto a giant pile of sticky dough. The more the captain struggled, the deeper he got stuck. The giant then dumped another handful of dough on top of him, folded him up like food, and placed him aside. Now, only the vegetables were left before the meal was ready. As the giant went to fetch them, Jack quietly sneaked inside. The princess was overjoyed to see him, but Jack immediately signaled her to stay silent. He first tried to unlock her cage, but the lock wouldn't budge. The princess told him to save the captain first, who had been lined up beside the pigs. Jack quickly rushed over and carefully cut him free from the sticky dough. Just then, the giant returned carrying the seasoning. Jack quickly handed the knife to the captain and hid. Luckily, the giant noticed nothing. He grabbed a bundle of sharp wooden skewers and stabbed one straight through a pig. Its scream stopped instantly. Now it was the captain's turn. The giant thrust another skewer toward him, but barely missed. The captain was so terrified that he fainted on the spot. The giant then carried everyone and placed them inside the giant oven. At this point, Jack was their only hope. Jack had already climbed onto an iron ring above the kitchen without the giant noticing. The giant then grabbed a massive knife, pulled the princess out of her cage, placed her on the table, and prepared to butcher her. Just as he raised the blade, Jack quietly grabbed another huge knife and drove it straight into the giant's back. The giant screamed in pain and thrashed wildly, but Jack held on tightly. Seconds later, the giant slammed into the wall and collapsed dead. The princess and the captain were stunned. Without wasting a second, the three of them rushed toward the magical beanstalk. But Roderick had already stationed another giant there as a guard. Seeing this, Jack came up with a clever plan. He and the captain quietly carried a beehive toward the sleeping giant. While the captain carefully lifted the giant's helmet, Jack dropped the entire hive inside. Before the giant could notice, the captain slammed the helmet shut and both of them quickly hid behind a nearby rock. A few moments later, the giant woke up screaming as dozens of bees began stinging him inside the helmet. The more he struggled, the more the bees attacked. Panicking, he started running, slipped over the rocks, and rolled toward the edge of the cliff. It looked like he was about to survive after pulling off his helmet, but at the very last second, one bee flew in and stung him again. Losing his balance, the giant finally plunged off the cliff. Jack, the princess, and the captain couldn't believe they had defeated such a massive giant so easily. They immediately prepared to leave, but the captain suddenly stopped. He insisted on staying behind to steal the magical crown from Roderick. Jack handed him his knife before continuing down the beanstalk with the princess. At the same time, the giant's body came crashing down through the beanstalk. Hearing the impact, the king rushed out of his tent, followed by the terrified villagers. Realizing the giants could invade at any moment, the king made a painful decision. For the safety of his people, he ordered the general to cut down the giant beanstalk. The soldiers hammered massive iron spikes into it, attached heavy hooks, and began pulling it down with horses and oxen. Slowly, the enormous beanstalk began shaking from its roots, but the violent movement immediately put the soldiers standing nearby in danger. Moments later, the thick central vine also started snapping apart. Soldiers lost their footing and began falling, throwing the entire area into chaos. Meanwhile, Jack and the princess were climbing down the beanstalk, but the moment they looked below, both of them froze in fear. The giant beanstalk had gone completely out of control and could collapse at any second. At that very moment, Jack grabbed the princess tightly and jumped toward a hanging vine. Swinging through the air, both of them rapidly descended. When they finally hit the ground, a huge pile of hay absorbed the impact, allowing them to survive without serious injuries. Meanwhile, Roderick gathered every giant and ordered them to prepare for the invasion of the human world. Just then, the two-headed giant sensed a human presence nearby, forcing the captain to stay hidden. Roderick then pulled out the magical beans that could grow giant beanstalks. But before he could use them, the captain suddenly attacked him. During the struggle, the magical beans were knocked onto a nearby rock, while Roderick fell into a deep pit below. Terrified, Roderick shouted for the giants to save him as the captain stood ready to finish the fight. The two-headed giant immediately ordered the others to dig him out. While the giant smashed through the rocks above, a fierce sword fight broke out below. Using his longer sword, Roderick quickly knocked the captain's weapon away and launched a relentless attack. The captain barely managed to block the strikes before both men locked blades in a brutal test of strength. Slowly, the captain began losing ground. Roderick overpowered him and forced his head underwater. Just then, the captain noticed his knife floating toward him. At the perfect moment, he grabbed it with his teeth and slashed Roderick across the face. Furious, Roderick fought back even harder and forced the captain toward the edge of the cliff. With one powerful kick, he sent the captain over the side. Luckily, the captain caught onto the rocks just in time. Roderick tried forcing him to let go by driving his sword into his hands, but he underestimated the captain. As Roderick attacked again, the captain grabbed the blade, drove it into Roderick's leg, and moments later plunged it straight into his stomach. Mortally wounded, Roderick collapsed and died. With his death, the magical crown lost its power. The captain climbed back up and rushed to retrieve the crown, but before he could reach it, part of the cave collapsed, allowing the two-headed giant to grab it first. He slipped the crown onto his finger, declared himself the new king, and instantly regained its magical power. The other giants immediately knelt before him. At the same time, the captain realized that the only remaining beanstalk connecting both worlds was about to collapse. Without hesitation, he jumped onto it. As the beanstalk tilted toward the castle, he timed his jump perfectly and escaped by diving safely into the water below. When the two-headed giant realized the path to the human world had been destroyed, he roared in frustration. Suddenly, the smaller head noticed the bag containing the remaining magical beans. Inside were 4 beans. Delighted, the giant immediately threw all 4 into the water. The moment they touched the surface, 4 enormous beanstalks burst out of the ground and shot toward the sky. The giant then ordered his entire army to climb the new beanstalks and invade the human kingdom. Finally, the two-headed giant himself leaped onto one of the vines and began sliding toward Earth. Meanwhile, Jack was watering his horse when he looked up and froze. Countless giants were descending from the sky. Without wasting a second, he mounted his horse and raced to warn the king. At the same time, the king's army was peacefully returning to the castle. Jack desperately shouted that the giants were coming, but no one understood what he meant. Seconds later, gigantic monsters burst out of the nearby forest, destroying everything in their path. No one could stop them. The giant army quickly caught up and swallowed one of the soldiers alive. Even the mounted knights couldn't outrun them. Humans were completely helpless against their overwhelming strength. One round-faced giant ripped the blades off a nearby windmill and hurled them toward the princess. The giant blades crashed into the ground, destroying everything around them and even knocking the king's crown off his head. Meanwhile, the soldiers guarding the castle spotted the king's army approaching and immediately sounded the alarm. The captain ordered oil to be poured into the moat to stop the enemy. As soon as the giant army reached the castle, the king gave the command to fire, and within seconds, hundreds of flaming arrows rained down toward the advancing giants. As soon as the flaming arrows landed in the oil-filled trench, a massive wall of fire erupted, blocking the giants for a moment. Taking advantage of the opening, the king's army rushed safely inside the castle. The moment the princess was confirmed safe, the captain ordered the main gates to be sealed immediately. But Jack was still outside, with several giants chasing him at full speed. As the massive gates slowly began to close, Jack realized he wouldn't make it. At the very last second, he urged his horse forward and leaped through the narrow opening just before the gates slammed shut. Unfortunately, the two-headed giant managed to climb onto the castle gate right behind him. Before it could force its way inside, the captain charged forward and struck it with all his strength, sending the giant crashing into the burning moat below. Flames instantly surrounded its body. Surprisingly, none of the other giants even tried to save it. They simply stood there watching as it burned. Everyone thought the danger had passed, but suddenly a gigantic iron bell came crashing down from the sky. It smashed through part of the castle wall, sending stones flying everywhere. Before anyone could recover, the real assault began. Huge iron hooks were launched toward the castle gates. The giants dug their feet into the ground and started pulling with incredible force, while the soldiers inside desperately tried to keep the gates closed. The entire entrance shook violently. This had been the round-faced giant's plan all along. He called even more giants to help tear down the gates. Inside the castle, chaos erupted. The princess quickly led Jack deeper into the fortress while the old king ordered every soldier to prepare their crossbows. More and more giants joined the attack, making the gates crack under the pressure. On the captain's command, dozens of giant crossbow bolts were fired into the wooden structures outside, and teams of soldiers desperately pulled them back using heavy winches. The king himself joined the defense, asking the captain if these monsters had any weakness. Before the captain could answer, burning trees suddenly came crashing from above, scattering the soldiers and breaking their formation. One flaming tree after another slammed into the walls, forcing everyone to retreat. It looked as if the gates would collapse at any moment. Meanwhile, Jack and the princess had almost reached safety inside the castle when a terrifying roar echoed beneath their feet. The ground suddenly cracked open and huge stones began floating upward. Then two enormous hands burst out of the floor. The two-headed giant had survived. The fire hadn't killed it because it had fallen into the water below. Using the underground tunnels, it secretly entered the castle without anyone noticing. The giant immediately caught the scent of royal blood. Jack quickly hid himself and the princess beneath a large blanket. For a few tense moments, it seemed like the giant hadn't noticed them, but then it smashed a nearby mirror into pieces, revealing their hiding spot. Realizing they had been discovered, Jack grabbed the princess and ran as fast as he could while the giant charged after them. With nowhere else to go, they raced toward the upper floors of the castle. Just as they thought they had escaped, one of the giant's massive hands burst through the wall and grabbed the princess. Without thinking twice, Jack grabbed a nearby axe and hacked at the giant's arm. The giant instantly caught Jack with its other hand while the smaller head mocked him. Fueled by desperation, Jack swung the axe again, smashing the giant's helmet. Furious, the giant opened its enormous mouth to devour him. That was exactly the chance Jack had been waiting for. He pulled out the last magical bean hidden inside his locket and threw it straight into the giant's mouth. The giant swallowed it without realizing what had happened. A few seconds later, something felt terribly wrong. Suddenly, a thick vine burst out from inside the giant's body. Then another, and another. Massive magical vines exploded through its chest and stomach, tearing the creature apart from the inside. The entire castle hall collapsed as the giant was ripped to pieces by the rapidly growing vines. As the dust settled, the giant's severed hand, still wearing the enchanted crown, landed right beside Jack. Outside, the soldiers continued fighting desperately against the remaining giants. But then the round-faced giant let out a loud command. Instead of attacking, every giant suddenly stopped moving. At the command of the round-faced giant, the giant army pushed forward and overwhelmed the soldiers. The castle gates began to break apart. The captain quickly ordered the iron gate to be closed, but the round-faced giant smashed through it with a single blow, allowing the giants to storm inside. They were just about to attack the humans when a loud voice stopped them. Every giant turned around, dropped their weapons, and suddenly knelt before someone. The captain was shocked. Jack stepped forward holding the severed hand of the two-headed giant, which still wore the magical crown. Since the crown controlled every giant, they immediately accepted Jack as their new king. Jack ordered them to stop the attack and return to their world, and every giant obeyed without question.